One way in which markets can potentially fail to reach the socially optimal level of production that a competitive equilibrium provides is if markets fail to be competitive. That is, if they're dominated by a monopoly. As discussed in the videos on monopoly, unlike perfect competitors, monopolies have the ability to manipulate their own prices. They can sell more and more cheaply, or they can sell less and at higher prices. We expect all firms to act in the way that they believe will maximize their profits, and that means producing the quantity or marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. For perfectly competitive price-taking firms, their marginal revenue is simply the price. So they produce where price and marginal cost are the same. At an industry-wide level, that means they will produce at the competitive equilibrium. However, for a monopoly, the ability to trade off price and quantity results in a marginal revenue curve that lies vertically below the demand curve. When a monopoly increases production by 1 unit, it receives additional revenue from the new unit produced. However, it also loses revenue from having to decrease its price to sell more units. This leads to a marginal revenue that is below the price. So, marginal revenue will equal marginal cost with a gap between price and marginal cost. That is to say, there are some units for which the consumer is willing to pay the marginal cost. That is, these units are value creating. However, the monopoly refuses to produce those units because it would hurt their profit to do so. What then can government do to solve this problem? The key is to get the monopoly to produce more. There are a number of strategies that one might consider for this. First, we could consider breaking the monopoly into multiple firms. This strategy would replace the monopoly with a competitive market. Since competitors don't have the pricing power that monopolies do, they would act like competitors and produce at the social optimum. However, this approach carries some significant downsides. First, it is not reasonable in the case of monopolies created by copyrights or patents. These monopolies are created intentionally to reward creativity and innovation. Having your company broken into pieces feels far more like a punishment than a reward to me. Second, in cases of natural monopoly, breaking the company into pieces means that each competitor is less cost efficient than the larger firm was. This cost inefficiency would create two effects. One, it would limit how much firms would want to produce, and two, it would create an incentive for the smaller firms to merge back together. So the government is stuck with a choice between blocking the mergers and having lots of inefficient companies charging high prices to cover their costs, or having a monopoly charging high prices because it has the power to do so. Second, we could consider removing pricing power from the firm. So, have a regulator set the price the firm is allowed to charge. At that point, the firm would act like a competitive firm would, taking the prices given and choosing quantity based on marginal cost. Ideally, the price would be set so that the firm produces at the intersection of demand and marginal cost. This type of policy we call marginal cost pricing. That is, the regulator sets the price equal to the firm's marginal cost. This particular variety of regulation has a weakness though. It's possible, and in the case of natural monopoly, fairly likely, that the monopoly may take a loss under marginal cost pricing. So, this policy could drive the monopoly out of business entirely, clearly not encouraging the monopoly to produce more. To overcome this weakness, regulators often use a version of what we call average cost pricing. So, rather than basing the price on the marginal cost of the firm, it is based on the average cost, including a normal level of profit. This allows the monopoly to continue operating without a loss, but has the downside of not reaching the optimal quantity. This strategy can also lead monopolies to take on unnecessary costs, providing perks like company cars and large offices for executives, for example, because those will be covered by the price based on the average cost. So rather than profits for the owners, we end up with perks for the executives. Historically, to prevent these inefficiencies, the government would often require that costs be approved by the regulator for prices to reflect them. Third, the government could provide the monopoly with a subsidy. Subsidies encourage firms to produce more, and this one is no different. The subsidy would have to be well tuned to avoid overcorrecting and is likely to turn into political opposition, but it is theoretically possible that a subsidy could work. One subset of this strategy would be to have the government just run the monopoly directly. This is fairly common for certain utilities. Water and sewer systems are often run by cities or counties in the United States, for example. The downside here is that once the system is politically run, it responds to political incentives rather than to economic incentives. For reasons we'll cover under government failure, this may result in an undesirable outcome. One last solution doesn't require government action at all. And in fact, we'd expect firms themselves to do it if they can. Price discrimination. Price discrimination eliminates the trade-off between price and quantity by allowing the monopoly to charge different prices to different consumers. We would typically expect monopolies to charge higher prices to those willing to pay more and lower prices to those who aren't willing to pay more. As long as price discrimination is practical, and it often is using things like membership discounts, coupons, and student discounts, it provides a way for a monopoly to make some money from an additional market that is not willing to pay the higher standard monopoly price. Overall, price discrimination leads the monopoly to produce more, moving us toward the social optimum.